Tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi. Kia koutou ngā kaitiaki o tēnei whenua, he mihi nui ki ngā iwi o te motu, ngā tangata o te upuku o te ika Māori. He mihi aroha, he mihi maioha, tēnei kia koutou katoa. 30 years ago, I began my doctoral research on academic socialisation. And as a sociologist, I was really interested in how people become academics. So I wanted to know what drew them to their disciplines, what defined their scholarship, and how they embodied their roles as critics and conscience of society. I absolutely loved that work. I loved being in close proximity to the passion and dedication of very clever people going about their daily lives in the academy, and I loved hearing them talk. So during that time in my doctoral years, I interviewed many scholars here in Aotearoa, and some of them were household names. They're people who you would recognise. I also interviewed others who shone brightly and brilliantly for a time, but then burned out, leaving academia for different kinds of lives outside the fiefdoms of the deans. And there were others still who flourished in less public forums. So that was in the kind of back rooms of the ivory tower. And they fed their fascination with the detailed and exacting work of their scholarship over the months and years of their very long careers. And for some of those quietly dedicated, it was a long time between eurekas, and yet they persisted, and I admired them all. But there was one sadness that I carried with me through that formative doctoral era, and that was that no matter how hard I looked, I never quite saw myself in any of those wonderful, passionate people with their brilliant, beautiful minds. And that was because, with very few exceptions, I didn't see wahine Māori like me, except in very occasional glimpses at the far distant other side of campus. So on the day that I graduated with my PhD in sociology with a secure academic job, as much as they were back then, here in Aotearoa, I was walking with my family under the gum trees of the ANU campus in Canberra, and there were galahs and cockatoos shrieking and swooping overhead. And I began asking myself what it would mean to be a wahine Māori scholar in a New Zealand university. And I realised I didn't know the answer. So since then, some of my research has circled around this very question. And in interviewing other Māori scholars in the years since, I've come to know myself and to see a life inside the university. And my story echoes theirs in so many ways. So what I'd like to do today is to finally answer that question of who I am as a Māori scholar in the company of other Māori scholars and who I stand for. So I'm first, like many Māori, I'm first in whānau to go to university. I'm part of a generation of Māori academics who've led relatively privileged lives in the sense that I've never gone hungry, I've always had shelter, and I've never been in state care. And in my world, that counts as privilege. But some of my whānau and some who are in my iwi continue to live in some really dark places. And so as a Māori academic, I stand for them always. But it's hard work, and that's partly because the blame for social harm is all too often directed at the most vulnerable and those most broken by systemic and structural injustice. So as Māori academics, what I have learnt in the course of working alongside Māori academics and using that as a research question, we need to find ways of speaking about that brokenness. And we need to do that without reinforcing it for those who come after us or closing down their options. And we also need to find ways of telling those stories of our brokenness as scholars without extinguishing hope. And that's because if hope is sometimes a scarce commodity, it's also the most powerful tool in a Māori academic's arsenal. So how do we do that? Because it is a huge task and there are absolutely no easy answers. But I think it's because we're living in uncertain times that I think our teaching and our research really does need to reflect that. And this is the message I get very loudly and clearly from Māori academics who have given me the time to talk to me in the course of my research. So this is what I've learned. We need to research for uncertain times. And we also need to research for precarious times. So as scholars and as critics and conscience of a society and a social contract that's failing so many of us, we need to learn to research courageously. So we need to go outside of those safe spaces where everything's mostly fine and there's a belief that we can solve decades of academic underrepresentation with an equity policy or a Friday afternoon diversity training session. So our scholarship should take us into zones of genuine uncertainty. So as scholars, I believe we do need to be willing to journey off the edge of our own maps and into uncharted waters. So we need to feel the fear and do it anyway. As educators of the Māori students who come into our space and those Pākehā who are interested in what we have to say and how we create the knowledge base, we teach in precarious times. So we need to teach courageously for those times. And to do that, as scholars, sometimes we need to walk into that burning building. And we can do that with our students. We can teach them how to walk through fire. And we can teach them at times to transgress. So how do we do this mahi? So I'm just going to talk about myself because I'm a sociologist and not everyone has a very clear idea about what sociologists do, so I'm going to tell you. Sociologists, we spend a lot of time thinking about how people's lives are shaped in all sorts of ways by the really big forces that surround them. So that's the political, the economic, the social forces, the historical forces, and they all shape our lives in really quite significant ways. So what sociologists do is that we begin by looking very intently at the ordinary, everyday moments that make up people's daily lives. And that's what I did back in the 1990s with all those wonderful academics. You know, for a lot of us, our lives are forged in those gloriously rich but often completely mundane details. So by studying that really closely, we can take those very ordinary things and by looking at them with such close attention, they can start to appear less familiar. They can start to seem almost strange. And that's a thing in sociology. As sociologists, we're taught from the very outset that our job as scholars is to make the familiar strange. And you hear that all the time in sociology. It's a constant refrain. So to make the familiar strange is to use our scholarship and our teaching to unsettle and rewrite the things that are taken for granted. So each day we get to see the familiar world anew in all its fantastical strangeness. So according to the American sociologist, the late C. Wright Mills, our scholarship sits at the intersections in those places where biography meets history. And those are the places where the small details of individual lives intersect and sometimes collide with the big forces of history. And that is the sociological imagination in action. So in that respect, sociology is always inviting us to transgress. And that's what I bring with me into the field of scholarship. Because for me as a Māori scholar, teaching and research is always a transgressive act. In the familiar world made strange, and that's the one that I inhabit every day, things can still be rewritten. endings aren't always set in place, and for many Māori academics, that's where we hope our scholarship will take us, to a world with better outcomes, not just for our own people, but for everyone. So as sociologists, we must admit to possibility, because where there's possibility, there's hope. And one of the vital ingredients of making the familiar strange in dark and angry times is the activation of hope. A few weeks ago, at a national hui in Ngā Roahia, Kingi tu heitia po tātou te wherowhero, the Māori King, that's my other Royal Society, spoke to a 10,000 strong crowd that was angry about government policies and the impact on whānau Māori and the environment. And this is what he said, and I quote, he said, "The best we can do right now is to be Māori, be who we are, live our values, speak our reo, care for our mokopuna, our awa, our maunga, just be Māori. Māori all day, every day. We are here and we are strong." So if we're going to investigate the splintered, fractured world that we live in and the treaty promises broken year after year and the huge existential threats that we all face, and of course we must do that, we also need to tell our stories of hope. Because in the end, living in precarious times requires the mobilisation of hope. And as Māori and as academia's familiar strangers, I think we do this well. So hope is often our very greatest strength, and it's the one that Māori scholars carry with us through the dark hours and through times of uncertainty. So we keep the fires burning always. And by doing that, we light up the night. Ka whawhai tonu mātou. Ake, ake, kia ora.
It is. Oh, thank you, Joanna, for a really thought-provoking presentation. So has anybody got any questions? Or comments that they want to make?
Kia ora. You made a comment that getting more Māori people into academia is not about equity policies, and Friday afternoon diversity workshops, absolutely, ka taukau that. My question is, what is the ways to, I'm assuming there's more than one way, but what are the ways to increase Māori in academia?
So one of the really exciting things that's happened in the last 20 years in Aotearoa has been the founding of centres of research excellence like Ngā Pai o te Maramatanga, which had in its first year of operation, it had the ambition to have 500 Māori graduates within 5 years, and then extended that. So I think it is about creating spaces for Māori where being Māori is accepted. Often when we walk into academia, we have to do a kind of performance of being the academic or being the Māori academic, and sometimes that mask that we wear is exhausting. So providing spaces where excellent knowledge, like through organisations like Ngā Pai o te Maramatanga, the Māori Centre of Research Excellence, that's one way of doing it. I think the other way, we can say that it is about bringing more Māori into the teaching spaces and research spaces, and that's really important. But it's also, once we're there, what happens, so how the institutions engage with us and what that means and what negotiations take place. So, I mean, that's a big part of the project. It's not an easy one. The numbers are increasing, but it is very, very slow. Kia ora for that question.
Kia ora. Can I just endorse what you said about the Centres of Research Excellence? So I'm involved in one called Putahi Manawa,
yeah.
And I have to say, as given it's kind of the 7 potentially plus 7, that's wishful thinking, but with a long-term program and far less focus on an output tomorrow, but
yes.
with a long-term, our particular core has attracted far more Māori academics than I think I've done in the last 20 or 30 years, despite trying. So I think that's a really good example of a type of research program that does actually enable these opportunities. So I just want to endorse that. There's not just the one example you mentioned. I think there's a number of them.
Kia ora, and Rhoda, actually I'm aware of the mahi that you're doing, and that is partly because the mahi is excellent, but also because it has got Māori clustering and through the kumara vine, and that's the other thing. You know, you can put out all the flash glossy brochures about how we would love to have Māori students come in, but what does tend to work quite well is when we're talking to each other, and that's what's happening with your group and many others. I mean, there are now others around Aotearoa that are having that level of success.
And Māori academics attract young Māori academics.
We do. Yeah.
That's my experience.
Kia ora.
Hi, I know nothing about sociology, but I have read something about how from the age of sort of 10 or 11, our future pathway is already pretty much decided, and whether we're going to be an academic or not. So although these centres of excellence are obviously wonderful, it sounds like we also need to be capturing the people that are already at primary school age.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really excellent point. When I went to school, there was an expectation. What I was told was that the best that I could hope for if I was going to have a really successful career might be a supervisor in a factory. I mean, literally, that was what I was told, and this is the experience of many, not just Māori Pacific young people from working class backgrounds. So it is about the messages and narratives and options that we place in front of young people much earlier than by the time we've got to university. If they haven't been given that awareness that might be an option, then they will probably be the supervisor in a factory, which is an absolutely fantastically good career to have. But there are many careers that should be left open to them. So thank you.